Hello, that's on. I'm going to make a request, which I know you're going to completely ignore, but I've been told to make it anyway. So if those at the back could move closer to the front, then your enjoyment of the keynote will be greatly enhanced. Okay, stay where you are. Barnaby Briggs is the chair of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, which is a UK-based global organisation that, as its mission, is to conserve wetlands and the wildlife associated with them. I first heard Barnaby talk a couple of years ago, and it struck me that he would be the ideal person to come and address this group. He's knowledgeable, he's been around the world, he's done a lot, he's seen things work and other things not work. He's passionate about wetlands and about wildlife and the role that wetlands in particular can and should and will play, in our efforts to save the planet. And he's practical. He's going to talk about things that work in the real world rather than things that only work in a PowerPoint presentation. But more important than all that, he can also be quite funny. So that mixture, in my mind at least, made him the ideal keynote speaker for this evening. So, Barnaby, over to you, sir.
So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you very much to the Friends of Bosque for inviting me to speak tonight. And it's a huge privilege. And in particular to Deb. Jonathan takes the credit for having the idea, maybe, but Deb has been a fantastic host. And so I'm a bit nervous, obviously, so I discussed with my wife how to do this, and she said, don't be charming, don't be too charming, don't be too witty, don't be too intellectual. Just be yourself. Great. So thank you so much for all the warm welcome and from the birding I've been doing in the last couple of days and getting onto the serious things. I saw the mountain lion signs, and that reminded me that very wise advice my father gave me, because it's very important advice. If you're being chased by a pack of taxidermists, don't play dead. So I want to talk about wetlands. I don't need to explain why I need to talk about wetlands, because they're magic, and we all know that. But I really want to talk about a little bit about what is a wetland and what they are, what they really consist of, and how threatened are they. But it's really, what's the point? What's the point of a wetland? And that's quite an interesting idea, because they're not just places on their own. They join up right across the country. And they can be really important in dealing with wider stuff. That might be climate, it might be carbon, it might be jobs. There's a whole lot of stuff around wetlands which needs organizing in our heads a bit. But really I wanted to show you this photograph, because this is a proper crane named after its call. And I'll talk about them later, but WWT reintroduced cranes into the western side of the UK. And one of the things you could do was go to the reserve, dress up in a crane suit, and feed the baby cranes with a crane beak, which was rather fun. And they're great, because they were reintroduced, they were taken down to a site a few miles away, and they've all come back to Slimbridge, where they were brought up to nest. So this brilliant photograph I took yesterday, or the day before yesterday, and I just wanted to make the point before we go into the sort of technical stuff about wetlands that this is a really dreadful version of it, but wetlands are quite beautiful, even the one in this photograph. And so that beauty thing is obviously a key driver to it. But the three things that I really want to get across tonight, just three things. If you can remember three things, that's it. Don't remember anything else. The first is that we can't do this, and I'll talk about what this is in a minute. We can't do this on our own. So we can't make more wetlands, we can't get bigger wetlands, we can't save all these ducks and geese and swans and cranes on our own. The second piece is that we need to do it at much, 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 much bigger scale. And I recognize that Bosque is about 10 times or 100 times bigger than any of the reserves that WWT has, but that's not nearly big enough. It's got to be way bigger. And the third piece is we need to know what works. So we've got to have underpinning science that's rock hard. So just three things. That's all I'm asking you to remember. It's not too hard. But immediately you're thrown into a problem as soon as you start saying, what is a wetland? Because the Ramsar Convention, which funnily enough WWT was a key part of starting. So Ramsar is a small town in Iran where the convention was signed. Peter Scott, the founder of WWT, was involved in the setting up of the Ramsar Convention. But it defines wetlands with all those words that I can't be bothered to read because I'm assuming that you can read them if they're big enough letters. But it's quite funny because actually, if you read it, it covers mangroves and coral reefs and a whole lot of other stuff that you don't really think of as wetlands. So what is a wetland? It's really quite hard to define them. Some of them are forests. Some of them are fields that are more or less wet. Some of the fields that I've been seeing here are not terribly wet. They can be huge. I don't know if you've been to the Sud. Have you been to the Sud? There's a thing called a shoebill that comes from the Sud. It's a crane with a sort of relation of the crane with a huge, great beak. But they can be tiny. They can be the back of this building could have what they call a sustainable urban drainage system, a SUD. So what's a wetland? Is it that or that? I don't know. And they change all the time. So they're quite difficult. It's really annoying. If you talk about trees and forests, everyone goes, yeah, I know what that is. You talk about wetlands, and it's like, what's that mean? And also, wetlands are a bit full of bugs, and you might get wet. And so we have a bit of an image problem. And we have a real problem on the back of that. Drain and swamp, yeah? Nearly 90% of them gone across the world. And we all know why. Farmland, concrete, drought. They're really, really threatened. They're very, very precious, what's left. Same as every other habitat. But interestingly, here in the US, if you really try, it's been shown that you can make things a bit better. But 45% of people in the UK don't know what a wetland is, which is quite extraordinary. So what sort of lunatics work on stopping the demise of wetlands? Well, this lunatic is the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, the best NGO in the world. It's the UK's leading wetland conservation charity, 75 years of experience in wetland conservation. A lot of people, and I don't know if you've ever managed volunteers, but they're difficult. 1,000 of them, and we have 80,000 members, 10 sites, so one in Wales, one in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland, and 7, is that right? In England. And also some amazing international work, Madagascar, Cambodia, and something called the spoon-billed sandpiper, which I will check whether you think it is the cutest bird in the world later. Been around for a while, quite well respected in the field, but not big in the NGO world. So what do you do with that? Let me talk a little bit about how it started. So Peter Scott, who was the son of the Antarctic explorer, who actually died in his tent with this letter saying, make the boy interested in natural history. There are quite a lot of people, including Konrad Lorenz. I don't know if you know that name. He's a very, very important German academic, very well respected, who always said, oh, the thing about Peter is he would have come back. His father, was ignored all the advice. Amundsen followed the Inupiat rules and got back, and Peter Scott might have got back. He was a shooter when he was young, and he used to go off into the marshes and shoot ducks and geese. But he didn't like the fact that they're beautiful birds and that some of them didn't then make it back to their summering grounds. And he started hanging on to them, started breeding them, started keeping them. And in 1946, he set up a charity in the UK, in the West Country. The interesting thing with hindsight is that he was so far ahead of his time that not only did he try and get the science and the conservation there, but he also opened it to the public, which was not a big thing in the UK at the time. And his idea was that people and wildlife should come together, and that people will only want to save the wildlife they know about or even love. So he was very keen to televise it. And there's some very shaky old black and white footage from the 60s filmed from his office in Slimbridge, which was the first live TV stuff on wildlife in the UK. He was also a brilliant sailor, a brilliant skater, a painter. He created the IUCN Red List, which is incredibly important for conservation, founding chair of WWF, and designed the panda logo. So he got around a bit. And I'll show you this photograph, which he's not in. So his wife is in the blue on the right. Duke of Edinburgh, obviously the Queen, and a previous director of WWT. The point of this picture is twofold. One is that Peter Scott knew how to get at the right people. And you do need the right people involved. It's not just it's not just supporters. You need some heavyweight support as well. But the other thing to look at is what the Queen is holding, the ex-Queen, dead Queen. How do you say it? I don't know what's the respectful thing to say. So look what she's holding. It's a bag of birdseed. And some goose has obviously done something dreadful. And that's the thing. I love that photo because it was the only photograph that was in the papers a couple of months ago when she died, which showed her laughing. And she's laughing because there's a goose or a duck it's probably a nene. So some of the first geese that Peter Scott saved were the nene geese from Hawaii, who are greedy as anything. I mean, you've never met anything more greedy. We have to feed them lettuce now because if you feed them actual corn, they just get fat. So the point of this picture is to show that Peter Scott was connected to all of these people. There's a museum in Slimbridge. When you come and visit, you must come and see it, with a tiny, really grotty table around which the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh sat and had lunch, around which they created the IUCN, around which they drew the logo. His kitchen was the centre of conservation in the UK. But the other reason for the photograph is because it's a bag of corn. It's a engagement with the birds thing going on here. And that's something that wetlands can do in a very special way. So what you're trying to do is sensibly and controllably bring people together with wildlife in a way that most people in the world are absolutely unaware that they've broken that connection. They just haven't got a clue. What's the difference between summer and winter? What's the difference? When do the geese migrate? It doesn't feature for most people. But by bringing people into these places, you can help them love them. But the trouble with all of that is you can end up as an NGO with 958 priorities. So how do you do it? How do you prioritize? So we only do 4 things as a charity. These are the only 4 things we want to do. They're sort of quite big when you unpack them, but the first one is this idea that you need bigger, better, more joined up wetlands. And for the UK in particular, it probably applies to the US as well. We've lost most of our wetlands, so it's really about making the ones we've got bigger, creating some new ones, joining them all up. Oh, but, and I'll come on to this, we run about 10,000, maybe 20,000 acres on a good day. So it's not going to be us doing this. So you see, when you start unpacking these things, it becomes quite interesting. So the first ambition, with a UK head on, and maybe this applies to the US, bigger, better, more connected wetlands. The second one is millions of people engaged with wetlands. Now, on a really good year, when you don't have too many pandemics, we can get about 1 million visitors in the UK. I can't tell you how grim it is as a visitor organization to not have any visitors. And some of the ducks really missed the people. It was quite funny. So how do you get millions of people involved in wetlands? Because we've only got 1 million. So what about the other 60 in the UK? 3 is, when you look outside the UK, and particularly into places like Madagascar and Cambodia, where we work most, there are some absolutely amazing wetlands which need to be protected. And then this piece is a little bit esoteric because there's things like the Ramsar Convention, the Biodiversity Convention of the Parties, even the Climate Change Convention, where you need to have wetlands built in. And I'll talk a little bit about carbon and wetlands. So we only do 4 things, but that covers a lot of ground. But we are the best NGO in the world. So that's just the introduction. What I really wanted to get to was this bit. So these are the 3 things I want to talk about tonight. Because I think these matter for conservation as a whole. This isn't about WWT's view. This is sort of me pontificating about the 3 things I think matter. So you've got all these wetlands. They're really important. They're really threatened. And there's organizations like WWT, which is perfect, and Bosque and Friends of Bosque, which is sort of quite good. But, and there's lots of other friends out there, lots of other friends. How do you work together to do this? And the 3 things I think you need to think about are, we need to work together. Now, the conservation movement is really good at fighting. We've for the last, since Rachel Carson, we've stood up and fought the bad guy, the man. Well, it doesn't work. That's the only thing. I was talking to my old boss at the RSPB, someone called Barbara Young, she's called Baroness Young of Old Scone. I have no idea why. Is it a stone, Old Scone? Is it a plate? I don't know. Anyway, and I said to her, I'm now doing WWT, and you've done RSPB, the Environment Agency, English Nature. She's a brilliant woman, done fantastic stuff. And I said, so what do we do about the fact that biodiversity's got worse since we started working on biodiversity? And she said, well, that's cheerful. But it's true. And she said, well, the only thing I can come up with is it's got worse more slowly. So what we've done in the last, as a conservation movement, what we've done in the last 20, 30, 40 years, it's got worse more slowly. Well, it's not too bad. I mean, in the old days, you'd spray DDT and you'd spray the drins and you'd shoot everything, and now it's not quite as bad as that. But we're going to have to work differently in the next 20, 30 years. And we can't have organizations on their own campaigning for the right way, because that's going to alienate the other people, whoever the other people are. So the first thing is we need to work together. I suppose that what's not in that sentence is we need to work together differently. The second thing is we need to work at scale, and I don't think this is a very difficult idea for you guys, because The scale of the wetland that we're talking about at the moment here is, I don't know, the Rio Grande. And that's the scale at which we have to work. You can't work one dot at a time. Doesn't work. The third one, I know I don't need to convince anyone in this room, but funnily enough, you do have to convince the policymakers and other audiences. You need to know your science because you need to know what works so that when you spend the money, it works. So those are the three things, and I'll just spend a bit of time on each. When I'm talking about partnership, and this is a really difficult one for WWT because although our founder was a shooter, it's still quite difficult for us to be seen to talk to shooters, duck shooters. But funnily enough, the best people we know in the UK who can tell bad duck shooters who shoot the wrong ducks at the wrong time and too many of them to go away and no uncertain terms and never come back are duck shooters. So we don't really need to talk to the bad guys because we can talk to our friends and they go into dark places that we can't go. But you need them on side. Farmers, and I'll talk a bit more about farmers in a minute, but farmers, ranchers, whatever they're called, they are vital allies. If you're going to have a wetland that is bigger than the reserve, there can't be a fence around a wetland, the water gets out. You've got to have your farmer on the other side of the fence who's farming in a way that doesn't mean that your birds die, simply. So in terms of those old, what used to be enemies, maybe, of the conservation movement, shooters and farmers, they can't be enemies anymore. They just can't. And then you've got these new people. Blue carbon is this thing, and I'll talk a bit more about what it is for us. For us, it might be tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of pounds in the UK. Probably already is hundreds of millions of pounds in the UK. At the moment, carbon sequestration in the UK starts with the word tree, and that's it. And no one's quite twigged that wetlands are better. I'll come on to that. But blue carbon is going to make a huge difference to wetland conservation because there might be enough money to pay for what we need to do. And then there's this funky stuff at the bottom, which I really don't understand, and luckily we've got experts who do. But there's obviously, clearly to all of us, a very easy, quick connection between mental well-being and a wet place, particularly a wild and wonderful wet place like you have on your doorstep. Governments are starting to recognize that, and there's money in it. We didn't even think there was. We did some work which showed the effects on your brain of being somewhere wet. It's very positive, it's very interesting. We didn't realize that the government was going to jump on it and say, right, off you go. The problem with that is keeping control of it, riding that horse and not being dragged. But one of the interesting things about, if we're going to work with all these other people who aren't conservationists, because I'm going to say that most of us are mostly conservationists in the way we think. But other people have different timescales. So if you talk to a farmer whose family, whose grandfather farmed that field 100 years ago, they think that 20 years ago is a heartbeat. And they think 20 years in the future is a relatively normal thing to be thinking. Whereas the agricultural subsidy mechanism in the UK is thinking 6 months ahead sometimes. So the difference in timescale is a problem. How do you work in partnership when you're all on different timescales? And sometimes, it seems a bit weird to say it nowadays, doesn't it? But sometimes governments have been in the lead on this stuff. Maybe in the 50s. Sometimes the conservationists have been in the lead. I have a feeling that farmers are about to take the wind out of all of our sails and work out that regenerative or low-till, no-till farming is going to save the world, and they'll go screeching off. And we need to go with them. So we've got some issues here with all these people. But we can do stuff. And this is a photo of Somerset at its best. So Somerset is in the west country of the UK. It rains a lot there. The government, in its wisdom, has allowed houses to be built in the wrong place. These are a brand new set of houses. And flooding is a real issue. Very expensive, very painful, and unfortunately flooding in the UK always involves sewage. I don't know why, but every time it floods there's some sort of sewage thing in there. And so these houses are almost, you have to redecorate completely once it's flooded. And so what WWT has done, and I hope you can read the words, I'll pick out some of them. They've been working on natural flood management. A bit of a different concept for you because you don't have any water, but we have lots. So this is working with 27 farms. The Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group is a farmers' advisory group. It's not a conservation group. They are a partner. And these little tiny things like hundreds of yards of hedges, 3,500 trees, livestock fencing, cross drains. I'll show you a picture of a dam in a minute, and you'll be amazed at the sophistication of the approach we've taken here. What you're trying to do with this is slow down the water. So the water would come through with a huge great peak, and all you're trying to do is get the peak lower. But imagine talking to 27 farmers, every single one of whom is Somerset, so you can't understand anything they say. And they've been doing the farming the same way they've been doing the farming forever, and why would they ever change? It turns out that's not actually what happens. They're longing to change. They're desperate to change. They're really interested in change. And you'll see why in a minute, because this is the high-tech dam solution. So this is called a woody dam or a woody barrier. All you're trying to do is slow the water down. All you're trying to do is encourage the farmer to allow that to happen or to make that happen. So it's really simple stuff, but this works. Of course, you could get a beaver to do it for you, and that's even cheaper. So you can take this stuff and turn it into tiny little things. You can create new ponds, hundreds of new ponds. And the really weird thing about ponds, which I didn't really understand, is that birds will go to them to feed because they get omega-3s or something. They actually get insects, there's special chemicals from insects that only are found in ponds. So the farmland pond in the UK is an important habitat in its own right. And this pond, I mean, you can see how big it is. It's tiny. Brand new, or even better, it was the old farm pond that the guy remembers that he used to have. That's even better. Because he probably swam in it or threw his brother in it or something. So what I'm saying is, on partnership, you can do it. The next one is on waterscapes. And here we're talking about big scale. And for the UK, that's obviously smaller than big US, but big scale for the UK. But it's about joining up stuff, perhaps joining up old stuff that used to be wet. And again, it's involving lots of other stakeholders, so these topics overlap. But when I say scale for the UK, this is sort of as big as it gets. This is a peninsula with a small village on this side. Move away from the microphone. With a small village on this side. This is the Severn Estuary, which has a tidal range of 40 feet. And the water in the Severn is, as far as I can work out, 98% mud, which I'll come on to. That is a power station with the world's biggest crane on it at the moment. It's got a name, like sort of Brian or something, I can't remember, but that's Hinkley Power Station. This channel was created by WWT. So this is 450 hectares, 450 acres. All these little sub-channels were created. At low tide here, when the tide goes out, there's a 7-meter cliff of mud. And the mud is really important. The reason for doing this was originally for flood protection. So those same floods I was talking about a minute ago, one of the reasons they happen is backing up from the sea. So if you can control the sea as the river goes into the sea, you help with the flood risk. Another reason was to compensate for land lost from sea level rise. So this is a government-funded project, £20 million, 740 acres, I think I've calculated. I don't know if I've got the maths right. It's managed as farmland and a nature reserve. So this is another thing I'll come on to, this sort of idea of the jargon is blended benefits. It's not just about ducks. It's not just about carbon, not just about eels. It's when you stack them all up, it becomes really quite important. But most importantly, it just shows you can do it. And this thing is absolutely heaving with birds and amusingly mice. So at very high tides, the whole thing floods, so you can't even see the channels. And the gulls fly over the reeds and they eat all the mice as they climb up to get out of the water, which I'm afraid makes me laugh, which just shows I'm a very sad person. But the thing that we discovered serendipitously rather than by design was that tidal range, a 40-foot tide of liquid mud being splodged onto the marsh every day, twice a day. Is that right? Yes, yes. Combined with the vegetation that lives on the marsh, means you store more carbon in a salt marsh than you do in a forest. If you use this calculation. This is a special calculation that shows it. I have no idea how the numbers work, but it looks good, doesn't it? It is definitely true for the Severn, which has this vast tidal range and is very muddy, and the mud is full of carbon. It's much less true of the estuaries on the right-hand side, the eastern side of the UK, which have much less of a tidal range. But no matter what the numbers are, in general, what we've demonstrated at Steart is that if you had, how big is Bosque? 57,000 acres. So if you had the equivalent of Bosque, created a coastal salt marsh by 2050 in the UK, and we've shown you can do it, we know how much it costs, we know which machine to use, we know which contractor can get the channels the right shape, you get to net zero, you'd store 1.5 megatons of carbon, that's like 770,000 cars off the road. So it's proper stuff, at scale, and we didn't even know this existed 5 years ago, blue carbon. No one knew about it. The point is, when you stack it all up, you get farmland, you get some rather good salt marsh beef, which is delicious. You get commercial fish stocks in the creeks. Those creeks are full of eels. Eels are, they want to be Americans, aren't they? Because they live in the UK, but they will only breed closer to America. It's weird. And then the glass eels, the little mini eels, swim all the way back from the Sargasso Sea and come to those creeks and grow into adult eels, which is a life, what a stupid life design. I mean, crazy. The only thing that's worse than that is a godwit flying from Alaska to Australia in one go. Anyway, get distracted. So it's part of protection for $6 billion worth of houses and businesses. It produces real value every year. This is a nature reserve which also provides for dog walkers, horseback riders. That's different. Is that the same as horse riding? I can never remember. And bird watchers are allowed there too. One of the issues we have is a constant battle with dog walkers, because the hay that we want, we have a hay meadow around part of the reserve. We cannot use the hay for stock because of the dog shit. And so we use that as an interpretation opportunity. We have a sign there saying, please bag your waste, and a long piece of stuff. And we never tell dog walkers not to come, and we never tell them to go away, because they're all our neighbors. We also have one of the ponds has a sign by it that says, if your dog likes swimming, please can he or she swim here, because he's got flea powder on. Flea powder has something that I can never say, neonicotinoid. That's right, neonicotinoids, and that kills everything in the water. So we say, if you're the dog owner and your dog likes swimming, please let him swim in this pond because this is set aside for him. So again, it's an opportunity to engage, not a sign saying, don't let your dog off the leash, don't let your dog swim, pick up your waste. You can't do that, they're your neighbors. It's complicated though, because we'd love to use that hay for something, we can't. So here are some facts about Steert, but there's the important thing, a really rubbish photograph taken by me of lots and lots of birds there. They're golden plovers and a lapwing. That one's the lapwing. The point is that now in Somerset, there used to be no avocets breeding at all, and now there are 150 pairs, and they breed at Steert. And. This works, this stuff. So Steert works. Waterscapes work. Partnership works. The final one then is science. And this is such fun. This is such fun because there's some really, really cool stories from the science side of what we do. And they demonstrate, you have to have it because you have to be able to say, we spent this much money and this thing happened. You can't say, we want to spend this much money and this thing will happen. You have to be able to say, this is what happened. This is a demonstration. And funnily enough, the head of WWT's science side often calls it, instead of science, demonstration. Because the science is sort of just a table stake. That's just what you have to do. What you're trying to do is, it can work. And species play a really important part in that. So the little gold pin on my lapel is a species of swan called a Buick swan, which you call a tundra swan. This is an incredibly important bird for WWT. It's our logo, it's one of the reasons Slimbridge is where it is, the headquarters. It's got an emotional story to tell. You can identify the individual Buick swans by the shape of the yellow on their bill. Peter Scott discovered this in his study, drawing swans. And he was drawing them and drawing them and drawing them and realizing that that was that one and that's that one, that's that one. And you could then identify the families. You could then see how successful they'd been. Telling that story, allowing people to connect with one swan is incredibly important. It's really scary though, because Buick swans, like a lot of your birds, are short stopping. So they're stopping in the Netherlands or they're stopping in Estonia. They're not coming to the UK. So that family of swans that we've been studying for 3-4 generations don't come. We don't even know if they're alive. So you've got to really tiptoe along this line between pinning everything on an emotional character, the swan, and then it doesn't come. What do you do? For WWT, that meant a really, really painful thing. We stopped doing that research, which is agony. It's like pulling teeth. Why would you do that? Your DNA is to study swans, and you're stopping studying swans. Why do you do that? We'll come on to that. On a more positive note, carbon. So no one knew about that salt marsh story and how important they are for carbon. The UK is starting, like many countries, to come up with ideas of how to sequester carbon. And we are writing the rule book on how you can do that in a salt marsh. So instead of rushing down a slope of just loads of money going into projects that may or may not work, and then everyone loses faith and it all goes wrong, we've spent rather little money, but we've written the rule book. That rule book has now been signed off by the International Conservation Movement, and now will then be adopted by the UK as the UK's way of doing salt marsh carbon. The UK then can persuade other countries, like the US, to do salt marsh carbon using the same rule book. So things like stacked benefits, salt marsh beef as well as carbon as well as eels, become built in from the beginning. But you can't win that argument unless you've got the science behind you. So it's not about the duck. Okay, so I didn't do a slide on this one because I wanted to tell the story. So there's a duck. Well, okay, the duck is really boring looking. It's the most dull duck you've ever seen, the Madagascar pochard. And it was thought to be extinct. The brilliant duck conservation group, the Peregrine Foundation, discovered the last 20 individual birds in the wild in Madagascar. And they weren't breeding successfully. The chicks would all die after about a week. And the reason they died is because they were on a lake that was very deep and they couldn't get to the bottom to feed. So WWT did something completely mad. They sent a team to Madagascar. They caught as many of them as they could, and they took all the eggs that they could find. And they bred them in a hotel bathroom. The hotel bathroom, I wish I should have had the photograph of that, actually. It's quite funny. But there's ducklings perched on the loo and around the bath and things, hundreds of them. There is now an aviary. They breed very well in captivity, but they didn't have anywhere to go. So we rescued them from extinction. But they didn't have anywhere to go because the lake they came from was deep. So we went and found a shallow lake. It had 10,000 people living around it, growing rice, in extreme poverty, not exposed to the outside world at all. So when they met the WWT team, they were like, "What are you doing here? It's crazy. This is the middle of nowhere. It takes 3 days to get there from the capital. The driving conditions are completely grim." The issue is that you need to have a lake to release the ducks onto that 10,000 people can also live nearby and depend on for their rice and for their other food. So we now have the head of aviculture, who's a lovely guy. He's from Newcastle. Actually, I can't understand anything he says, so you wouldn't have a hope. His accent is so strong. And I won't imitate him, but that's his phrase. Because he is only interested in ducks. He loves ducks. He's a very good, he can listen to ducks in their eggs and charm them out into healthy chicks. And he realized that to save the Madagascar pochard, it's not about the duck. It's about the 10,000 people who live around that lake, helping them get better lives, and the duck can coexist with them. This has gone so well, we've got another lake. And interestingly, not just another lake. The project manager, who is someone from Madagascar, is now on the Presidential Advisory Board for Biodiversity Protection in Madagascar, one of the most difficult countries to work in terms of biodiversity. So it's not about the duck, but it started with the duck. You did have to breed them successfully, though. And this whole story about head starting, which is kind of what we did with the pochard, but even more so with what I'll talk about next, is all based in science. So if I keep going on science, look at this place. So this is the Ooze Washes. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? So these two dikes here, levees here, create a flood protection system. It's relatively new for the UK. So it started in 1630 and finished in 1656, slightly interrupted by the Civil War. So it's a relatively new feature. The point about it is this photograph shows it in sort of full flood. And it's protecting hundreds of thousands of homes in very flat bits of the UK. So this water needs to go somewhere. It's a 6,000 acre nature reserve, which fills with water. So that's great in one way, big nature reserve. It's bad if all your birds are nesting when it fills with water, and wet springs is a part of the feature of the UK at the moment. So if you look at these fields, this is something we call lady fen. Lady fen is sculpted into carrot field. So these are all carrot fields. You could see they do have different shapes and sort of puddles in them. And those are paleo channels or old bits of wetland. Whole thing was drained by our lovely Dutch friends in the 1630s. And we've recreated Lady Fen. And when I went to the reserve, the visitor centre, which is that thing there, which I don't know if you can see, but there's a bridge that goes from the reserve, or the visitor centre. You see that little thing there? That's the bridge. Completely pointless bridge that goes across a road. Peter Scott loved it. Everyone hated it. It's completely pointless. Anyway, beside the point. Lady Fen now has more breeding godwits on it than the washes behind, because the godwits have realised that the floods are really quite bad news. To do that, we had to know that creating a wetland works. We had to show how a wetland works. And we had to work in partnership with government agencies, other NGOs. There's another reservoir actually up this way, which controls the water coming in, which again is very large, has to be managed very carefully by, in terms of levels, by the government agency, which does the water levels. Familiar stuff to you all, I'm sure. So what you've got is a wetland that was created as a flood control, has a huge biodiversity gain, but it's complicated. So you have to build a new thing. You have to work with partners in a very complicated way. And it's all really, well, one of the pieces out of it is godwit and back to head starting. So take one step back. So you've got ooze washes, you've got godwits. I want you to go one step back and just go 8,000 miles to the east. And remember, this is very technical, very science-driven. No emotion governs any of this stuff. Oh. So this is, I think you'll agree, it wins the competition for the cutest baby bird. It says baby spoon-billed sandpiper. Completely insane bird, whoever designed it. A population of about 120 breeding pairs, declining at 26% at the beginning of the project every year. So completely doomed. A massive plan of attack to save this bird. First and very successful was to persuade China to protect vast, vast areas of wetland, which they have done. And also to work with Burma, Myanmar, to protect wetland and to prevent people on the wetland hunting. That's been very successful, and that has had a huge impact. But even more successful was to take the first clutch of every spoonbill sandpiper nest that could be found and head start them. So this was started, 10 years ago. Take these birds, which are precious beyond precious, and the same bloke from Madagascar with the same accent, no one could understand. I mean, imagine the Russians trying to cope with a Newcastle accent. He hatched these again in his bedroom in the far eastern Russia. So you take the first clutch, head start them. Second clutch, you let the parents go and try and do it. But there's lots of Arctic foxes, lots of bears. They do tend to hoover them up. These guys, you grow them up until they're a little bit bigger. You head start them. And I'm not saying the species is safe, but these funky birds are more numerous than they used to be. So head starting worked in an emergency. So could we use it in the ooze washes? Which means, is our science and our aviculture good enough to work at scale? And that's the target. Black-tailed godwit. They mate for life. Very sensibly, I think, the males and the females winter in completely different parts of the globe. And one of the trackers we fitted to a female godwit ended up in, I think it's called Bosque in Mauritania. That's just where the majority of the British female godwits go. And the males don't go quite as far. They're sort of Spain and northern Africa. 50% decline across Europe in 25 years. There's such a common bird in Holland that the farmers have a name for them, which is onomatopoeic, which I won't say because it's lots of G's and R's in Dutch, which I can't do. So over the 3 years of the project, the aviculturists and the scientists at WWT increased the UK population by 350%. So this is the sort of crunch, really. Those are the Buick swans. Probably if you talk to the right person in WWT, they'd know the name of that swan from the shape of the yellow. And we don't count it anymore. We don't do family surveys anymore. We don't even do the wetland bird survey, WEBS, which was set up by WWT. We've got other partners doing that now. We don't do it. We're doing godwits. We're doing spoonbill sandpipers. We're doing steered. We have to choose. And it's not just painful. There are individual people whose careers were pinned to some of these birds. It's really, really tough. So I'm not trying to say any of this is easy. But you remember the crane at the beginning? The proper crane, not your sandhill crane. We've reintroduced it successfully into the UK, into the western side of the UK. It turned up naturally in the eastern side, and we're hoping that the two populations get to meet. But there are hundreds of cranes breeding in the UK which weren't before. There are millions of people visiting reserves in the UK to look at wildlife. When you come to Slimbridge, you can come and see cranes and some of the swans. So I only wanted to say three things. We can't do this on our own. We have to work in partnership. We must do this at scale. And we must think about waterscapes. And we need to know what works. The science needs to be spot on. And I'm just determined, we covered this last night over dinner, I'm determined to be optimistic about this stuff. It's so easy to say, you know, the end of the world's coming, the financial, the economic crisis is hideous, the well-being crisis is even worse. And have you seen the picture of the tsunamis? You know, the COVID is this size, then you've got climate change, and then you've got the biodiversity crisis is the big one. What would you do? Give up? No, you can't. What WWT has shown, and what you've shown here, is that wetlands can be saved, can be grown, can be expanded, that we don't need to do all the work. By we, I mean the conservation movement. Our friends in the farming, the shooting, the hunting, the industry, all those other friends we have can help pay for this. And all we have to do is work a little bit differently. Simple, isn't it? So that's all I had to say. Thank you very, very much indeed for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you. So I'm very happy to answer any question you have by referring you probably to Jonathan. Yes?
You mentioned Cambodia, and in terms of waterscapes, the Tonle Sap is enormous. Are you working in that area?
So we work, the cranes that we're particularly interested there, which are Saras cranes, maybe? Yes. The ones we look after in the winter spend the summer around the Tonle Sap. That's where they breed. The Tonle Sap is a focus for a number of other organizations. No one was looking after the wintering grounds of the crane. So we do the wintering grounds. Again, the story in Cambodia is all about the community because most of the cranes are using rice paddy. So it's about understanding rice and the difference between 1, 2, or 3 rice crops a year and how you integrate that with community development. Yes?
Are any of your wetlands troubled by droughts? So how do you address that?
Well, yeah, funny enough, that what tends to happen in the UK is both. So if you think of the Ouse washes there, they suffer from flooding, particularly in the spring, so the whole of that top bit of the slide gets swept through with floods. But the land either side has been drained for whatever it is, 400 years, and it was peat. The peat has mostly blown away because it's been dried out, and so the water then is not retained. So funnily enough, you get a drought and then a flood and then at the same time. So it's almost worse. The issue there is it's sort of so simple in concept, but quite hard to do. It's sort of just add peat. So add carbon and add things to the soil that retain the water. And that lady fen, interestingly, is already showing signs that if you manage it for wildlife and you retain water deliberately and you graze it in a certain way, most of the reserves, so one of the big differences I'm seeing this week is most of the reserves I'm used to seeing have grazing on it, quite a lot of it, and the grazing is quite, mashes up the soil as much as anything else. So you're seeing ladyfen deal with water retention better than the fields immediately alongside it, to the extent that the local farmer who did the leaning on the gate thing when we first arrived, of you don't want to do that. Now he's saying, all my soil's gone. I think I've got about 8 more years before I'm going to go bust. How do I do what you did? So there's a really interesting dynamic, mostly when you've got, at the same time, too much and too little water. Anyone else? Anything else? Jonathan can answer all of those ones then. I turned the mic off. Yeah, you have to turn it on.
So, I'm hoping we go away this evening. Is it on? You told me to switch on.
I did. I just lied to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm hoping that our takeaway from what Barnaby's been telling us is a message of hope, that there are ways of making things work, even though it's going to require us to work a little bit differently, as Barnaby has said. And he's proved that by working a little bit differently, a huge difference can be made anywhere in the world. So if it can work in Russia, if it can work in the west of England, then it's got to be able to work here. So these are all messages that are relevant to us. I'm hoping we can take what Barnaby's told us and put it into practice as we go forward. So just ask you to put your hands together one more time for Barnaby.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,